As we're going into these a little bit more complicated examples, what I want to point out here is if we look back at this quadratic formula, this is equal to 0. So just as a note, the equation must be set equal to 0 before starting. So that means if my equation was equal to 4, I would subtract 4 from both sides first, because then that makes it equal to 0, and then we can keep going. I sadly did not put examples like that. I kind of did with F and G. We'll get there. Alright, so once again, we're going to start. I see this is equal to 0, so we're good to go. A equals 1, B equals -4, C equals +10. Now, for quadratic formula, x equals -b. Well, in this case, b is -4. So if I do, another way to think about -b is taking the opposite of b. So if b is -4, opposite b is going to be +4. Plus or minus the square root, -4 squared minus 4 times a, which was 1, times c, which is 10. All over 2 times a, which is 1. Okay, once again, let's just refresh our memory. Denominator and discriminant. We'll take care of our d's first. Plus or minus square root. Now remember, I said this is a calculator-friendly class, and if you look at the bottom of this page, I've actually made a place for us to put some little tips for using the calculator. And so one of those things that we're going to put in down here is what we wrote and read up last time. You can type the discriminant not the radical, so not the stuff under the radical, but the actual stuff, sorry, not the radical itself, but the stuff underneath the radical. You can't type in anything else because your calculator is going to give you decimal crap, and we actually prefer our answers to be exact, meaning we still have radicals and things in there. Also, your calculator doesn't do imaginary numbers, which is unfortunate. And so when you're typing this into the calculator, another tip for you, I want you to include all parentheses. Here's what I mean by this. If I look at this example, you see how I have this parentheses, -4 being squared? That was intentional that I wrote that in parentheses. If you do not have parentheses around that in your calculator will actually only square the 4 part of that and not the negative. Moral of the story, it gives you the wrong answer. So, quote, you best have parentheses, close quote. The quote, I just quoted myself, actually. So, you are welcome to quote me as well. You best have all your parentheses there. Okay, so I'm just going to type that in directly as it is. Something else that I want to point out here. This is minus 4ac, aka subtraction. So I'm going to put that here. I'm trying to give you head warning of what I've seen. I want you to make sure you are subtracting 4ac when you type it into your calculator, not negative 4ac. There is a difference. So, I'm going to type this in, And what am I going to include? Oh, that parentheses. We're going to go -4. All of that, we're going to square it. Okay, so that gives me +16. That's just what it's saying to me right now. -4 times 1 times 10. And I get -144. All of that over 2. All right? So now that I took care of my discriminant and my denominator, took care of my d's, now we're going to go for my r's. Radical and reduce. So my radical, well, I know the square root of 144 is just 12, but it's a negative, so this is 12i and over 2. We don't choose the on adventure because guess what? There's an imaginary number. We only split it up to solve it when we do not have radicals or imaginary numbers. So with the reduce, I'm going to get a little bit more specific up here with reduce. Sometimes when we reduce stuff, we're going to be left with a radical, or in this case, we have an I. Now these three numbers, I call these three numbers the Three Musketeers because they reduce all together or not at all, meaning they all have to be divisible by the same number. So 4, 12, and 2. All of those are divisible by 2, which means if I go ahead and divide everything by 2, I get 2 plus or minus 6i all over 1. Well, anything divided by 1 is just itself. So I just get 2 plus or minus 6i as my final answer. I know these are taking a long time for me to explain, but like I said, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with common mistakes. It's not going to take you as long when we're not talking through every step. Let's go to part E. I see it's set equal to 0. So I can identify A, B, and C, and now just plug it in. Okay, once again, x equals -b, or opposite b. So since b is -6, it becomes a +6, plus or minus the square root of parentheses, yep, that's intentional, b squared, minus, aka subtract 4, times a, which is 2, times c, which is 5, all over 2 times a, which is 2. All right, I'm going to type that goodness into my calculator. Parentheses, -6, close parentheses squared, subtract 4 times 2 times 5. All over 2 times 2, which is 4. Okay, I'm going to work on that radical. Square root of -4 is 2i. And now I can just reduce everything all together. So the 6, the 2, and the 4, all of those are divisible by 2. So I get 3 plus or minus 1i, which is the same as just I, over 2. And that's my solutions. So let's get to something like part F, where here it's not set equal to 0. Well, I'm just going to get it equal to 0 by subtracting or adding stuff over. I personally like to deal with my x squared as my positive term, so I like to move everything to where the x squared is. And I'm going to rewrite this in standard form. So 5x squared plus 5x minus 8 equals 0. Now that it's equal to 0, I can pull out a, which is 5, b, which is also 5, and c, which is -8. X equals -b, b is 5, so -b is -5, plus or minus the square root of parentheses b squared minus 4 times a, which is 5, times c, which is negative 8, all over 2 times a, which is 5. I'm just going to do 2 times 5 right now, which is 10, because it makes me feel accomplished. Okay, calculator time. Minus, let's see, 5 squared minus 4 times 5 times negative 8. I get 185. All right, here's some good stuff. Okay, we need to simplify this square root. So I need to look at the square root of 185 and see what reduces. Because it ends in 5, I know it's divisible by 5. 5 and 37. Well, it turns out neither of those break down. So guess what? We're done. The reason I'm done here is because square root of 185 does not simplify any further. And also, I cannot reduce the negative 5 and the 10. Those have to stay because remember, it's everything outside of the radical. Like all 3 numbers need to reduce together. This is like a 1 out here. 5, 1, and 10 cannot all divide by the same number. And so I actually just have to leave it. And it's because of that plus or minus that it gets into that. So unless you are reducing all 3 numbers that are outside of the radical, you don't reduce, just like we did. Well, in part G over here, wait a minute, we are missing something. This is not, like we have a 3x squared, and I should have something in the middle there, but I don't. Well, here's what we can do. If you are missing a term, use 0 as a placeholder. Meaning I can rewrite this as 3x squared plus 0x minus 8. Because I was missing that middle term, so I'm just going to put a 0 with it. And now I can do the same thing. A equals 3, B equals 0, C equals negative 8. And now to our fun formula, x equals negative b. Negative 0 is not a thing, so it's still going to be 0, plus or minus the square root of 0 squared, because it's b squared, minus 4 times a times c, all over 2 times a. 0 plus or minus the square root. Calculator time is my favorite time. Okay, negative 4 times 3 times negative 8 becomes a positive 96. Divide that by 6. Okay, so that took care of my discriminant and my denominator. Now we just radical reduce. Remember, discriminant, denominator, radical reduce. Meaning, we're going to simplify 96. It's an even number, so I know it's divisible by 2. 48. Divide that by 2, and I get 24. 2 and 12. 2 and 6. 2 and 3. I like to cross these out just so I don't use them anymore. All right. So it looks like this is going to reduce to, remember, if this becomes every circled pair, one of those numbers comes out. So it's 2 times another 2, which becomes 4. And then I'm going to multiply that 2 root 3 on the inside. And then it's a 6 in the denominator. Okay, this 0 plus or minus 4 root 6, well, that turns out just becomes plus or minus 4 square root of 6. And now I can reduce the 4 over 6. So 4 over 6 reduces to 2 over 3. Well, cool. Yep, that's pretty much all I have for you. Just remember, I would point out with this last example, I hope you noticed that this root 6 was left alone. I'm going to rephrase that. A value inside the radical cannot be divided by numbers outside of the radical. That is why that root 6 stays the same. Okay, that's quadratic formula, friends.